the four eras of the Japanese Empire, and a grand overview. The story of the Japanese Empire stretches across myth, legend, war, and transformation, and it begins with a land of islands rising from the mist of the Pacific Ocean, where early people believed their rulers were descended from the gods and where nature itself was sacred and alive. The first great era is the age of myth and early state formation, when figures such as Emperor Jimmu are said to have founded the imperial line, and when small clans slowly united into a centralized authority under the early Yamato court. This was a time when the foundations of culture, religion, and identity were laid, as Shinto beliefs blended with influences from the Asian mainland, especially from China and Korea, bringing writing systems, governance models, and new technologies. The second era is the age of the shogunate and the samurai, when real political power shifted from emperors to military leaders, and when warriors bound by codes of honor rose to dominate society. In this era, leaders like Tokugawa Ieyasu brought stability after long centuries of civil war, creating a rigid but peaceful society that lasted for generations. Cities like Edo grew into vast urban centers filled with merchants, artisans, and common people living structured lives under strict rules. Trade existed but was limited, and the country turned inward, preserving its traditions while the rest of the world changed rapidly. The third era is the age of imperial expansion and transformation, when Japan opened to the world under pressure and then rapidly modernized during the leadership of Emperor Meiji. In just a few decades, the nation transformed from a feudal society into an industrial and military power capable of competing with Western empires. Railways, factories, modern armies, and new forms of government reshaped the land. This era saw Japan expand beyond its islands into Korea, Taiwan, and parts of China, establishing itself as a powerful empire in Asia. The fourth era is the age of conflict, collapse, and rebirth, when Japan reached the height of its imperial ambitions during the early 20th century, but also faced devastating war. During this time, the empire fought in massive conflicts across Asia and the Pacific, culminating in World War II, where its expansion brought it into direct conflict with major world powers. The rise of courts power and the early imperial state. As the Yamato rulers strengthened their control over the islands, the idea of a unified Japan began to take shape, not just as a collection of lands, but as a structured realm governed by law, ritual, and hierarchy. The court sought to model itself after the great dynasties of China, adopting systems of bureaucracy, taxation, and administration that could organize a growing population. Scholars, monks, and envoys traveled across the sea to learn from the Tang dynasty and returned with knowledge that reshaped governance, writing, and religion. Buddhism arrived during this period and spread alongside Shinto beliefs, creating a layered spiritual world where temples rose near shrines and where rulers used religion to reinforce authority. Great temples were built with towering wooden halls housing massive statues and sacred texts. These structures were not only places of worship, but also symbols of power and unity. The capital at Nara became a center of culture, learning, and political life, where the emperor ruled through a network of officials and aristocratic families. Daily life in this era depended heavily on social rank. Nobles lived within courtly compounds surrounded by gardens, ponds, and carefully designed architecture, while peasants worked the land producing rice that sustained the state. Clothing, food, and even speech reflected one's place in society. The court valued elegance, poetry, music, and ritual, and these refined practices shaped what it meant to be civilized in Japan. Transportation improved slowly as roads connected the capital to distant provinces and messengers carried orders across the land. Boats remained vital for moving goods and people along the coast. Trade expanded both internally and externally, bringing silk tools and ideas that enriched society. Yet, beneath this order, tensions grew powerful. Families within the court began to compete for influence, and the emperor's authority was often shaped by those who could control access to power. Over time, these rivalries weakened centralized rule and opened the door for new forms of leadership to emerge beyond the court. The Age of Warriors and the birth of the samurai. As court authority weakened, local leaders began to rely on armed retainers to defend their lands and assert their influence. These warriors became known as samurai, and their rise marked a turning point in Japanese history. Bound by loyalty, courage, and a growing code of conduct, they formed the backbone of a new political order centered on military strength rather than courtly tradition. Clans such as the Taira and Minamoto fought for dominance in a series of conflicts that reshaped the country. The Genpei War stands as one of the most dramatic struggles of this era, where battles were fought on land and sea with fierce intensity. Warriors clashed with bows, swords, and spears, and stories of their bravery and tragedy would be passed down for generations. From this conflict emerged Minamoto no Yoritomo, who established the first shogunate in Kamakura, creating a system where the emperor remained a symbolic figure while real power rested with the shogun and his military government. This marked the beginning of a dual system that would define Japan for centuries. Life during this time was shaped by constant readiness for conflict. Castles and fortified residences were built on hills and strategic locations, offering protection and control. Villages organized themselves around local lords who provided security in exchange for loyalty and resources. Trade continued but was often disrupted by war, making stability fragile. Samurai culture emphasized discipline, training, and honor. From a young age, warriors were taught to fight, ride horses, and master weapons. They followed principles that valued loyalty to their lord above all else, even above their own lives. These ideals would later evolve into the concept of Bushido, shaping the identity of the warrior class. Despite the violence, this era also saw cultural growth. Zen Buddhism gained influence among the samurai, promoting focus, simplicity, and inner strength. Art forms such as ink painting and poetry reflected these values, creating a balance between war and reflection. The era of warring states and the struggle for unity. Over time, the authority of the shogunate weakened, and Japan entered a long period of fragmentation known as the Sengoku period, or the Age of Warring States. During this time, powerful regional lords called daimyo fought relentlessly to expand their territories and secure dominance. Alliances shifted quickly, and betrayal was common as ambition drove leaders to seek greater power. The land was filled with fortified castles rising above plains and mountains, serving as centers of control and symbols of authority. These castles were surrounded by towns where merchants, artisans, and farmers supported the war efforts. Roads connected these domains, allowing armies to move and supplies to flow, but they also became paths of invasion and destruction. Weapons and tactics evolved during this era. The introduction of firearms changed the nature of warfare, making battles more deadly and strategic. Large armies clashed in open fields, and sieges became common as lords sought to capture enemy strongholds. The scale of conflict grew as leaders commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, shaping battles that would decide the fate of entire regions. Among the many figures of this time were leaders who sought not just to survive, but to unify the country. Oda Nobunaga used innovative tactics and ruthless determination to defeat his rivals, breaking the power of traditional institutions that opposed him. Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued this effort, bringing much of Japan under his control and attempting to extend his influence beyond the islands through campaigns in Korea. Daily life for ordinary people was marked by uncertainty. Farmers worked under the constant threat of war, while townspeople adapted to shifting rulers and changing conditions. Food supplies could be disrupted, and communities often had to rebuild after battles. Yet trade and craftsmanship continued as people found ways to survive and even thrive amid chaos. This era of conflict set the stage for the eventual unification of Japan under a stable government, ending centuries of warfare and opening the path to a new age of peace and order. The peace of the Tokugawa and the shape of a closed world. After generations of war and shifting alliances, a new order finally emerged under the leadership of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who established his rule after victory at the decisive Battle of Sekigahara. This moment marked the beginning of a long period of peace known as the Edo period, where the Tokugawa Shogunate governed Japan with careful control and strict social structure. The emperor remained in Kyoto as a symbol of tradition, while real authority rested in the hands of the shogun in the city of Edo, which would grow into one of the largest cities in the world. Society during this time was organized into clear classes, with samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. Each group had defined roles and expectations that shaped daily life. Samurai no longer fought constant wars and instead became administrators, scholars, and enforcers of order. Farmers worked the land producing rice, which served as both food and currency, while artisans created tools, textiles, and goods that supported urban life. Merchants, though often considered lower in status, grew increasingly wealthy through trade and commerce. The government imposed a policy of limited contact with the outside world, restricting foreign trade and influence in order to maintain stability and prevent disruption. Only a few controlled ports allowed carefully monitored exchange with select countries. This isolation helped preserve traditional culture, but also slowed exposure to global developments. Cities flourished during this era, especially Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, where bustling streets were filled with shops, theaters, and markets. People traveled along well-maintained roads, such as the Tokaido, connecting major regions. Inns provided rest for travelers, and goods moved steadily across the country, supporting a vibrant economy. Food culture expanded with regional specialties, and common meals included rice, fish, vegetables, and pickled foods enjoyed in both simple homes and lively urban eateries. Despite the stability, tensions existed beneath the surface. Economic changes challenged the rigid class system, and natural disasters occasionally brought hardship. Yet overall, this period allowed Japan to develop a rich cultural identity expressed through art, literature, theater, and philosophy. Kabuki performances, woodblock prints, and poetry captured the spirit of the time, creating a legacy that would endure long after the era ended. The opening of Japan and the shock of a changing world. In the 19th century, the isolation of Japan came to an abrupt end when foreign powers arrived, demanding trade and diplomatic relations. Among them was the American fleet, led by Commodore Matthew Perry, whose ships appeared in Japanese waters with a display of force that made clear the changing balance of power in the world. Faced with this pressure, the Tokugawa shogunate agreed to open ports, ending centuries of relative isolation and setting off a period of intense change and uncertainty. The arrival of foreign ideas, goods, and technology challenged the existing order. Some leaders believed Japan must adapt quickly to survive in a world dominated by industrial powers, while others resisted, fearing the loss of tradition and sovereignty. This conflict led to political turmoil and ultimately the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. In its place, the imperial system was restored under Emperor Meiji, marking the beginning of a new era of transformation. The government moved rapidly to modernize, adopting Western technologies, building railways, factories, and a modern military. Education systems were reformed and industries developed at an astonishing pace, turning Japan into a competitive nation on the global stage within a few decades. Cities transformed as new infrastructure reshaped daily life. Steam-powered trains connected distant regions, while telegraph lines allowed communication across vast distances. Clothing styles changed, architecture evolved, and the rhythm of life accelerated as people adapted to new opportunities and challenges. For many, this era was both exciting and difficult. Traditional ways of life were disrupted, and people had to learn new skills and navigate unfamiliar systems. Yet the determination to strengthen the nation drove rapid progress and laid the foundation for Japan's emergence as a modern state. The rise of an empire and expansion beyond the islands. As Japan modernized, it also began to look outward, seeking resources, security, and influence beyond its shores. This ambition led to conflicts with neighboring powers and the gradual expansion of Japanese control into other regions. Victories in wars against China and Russia demonstrated the strength of Japan's new military and shocked the world as an Asian nation defeated established powers. Japan established control over territories such as Taiwan and Korea and extended its influence into parts of China. These expansions were driven by a desire for resources, strategic advantage, and national pride. But they also brought complex challenges. Governing distant lands required administration, infrastructure, and military presence. Local populations experienced changes in leadership, economic systems, and cultural policies that often created tension and resistance. In these territories, Japan built railways, ports, schools, and government institutions, aiming to integrate them into its imperial system. Officials and military leaders were appointed to oversee development and maintain order. Some regions saw economic growth, while others faced exploitation and hardship as resources were directed toward the needs of the empire. Back in Japan, cities continued to grow and industrial output increased, supporting the expanding military and economy. Factories produced goods for both domestic use and export, while new technologies improved transportation and communication. Society became more complex as urban populations expanded and new social classes emerged. The empire reached a point where its influence extended across East Asia, marking the height of its expansion. This period was filled with both achievement and tension, as the demands of empire placed increasing strain on resources and relationships with other nations. War on a global scale and the height of imperial power. The early 20th century brought Japan into a series of larger conflicts that would define its place in the world. As global tensions rose, Japan aligned itself with other powers during World War I, gaining territory and influence in the aftermath. However, it was the events leading up to and during World War II that would mark the peak and turning point of the empire. Driven by a desire for resources and strategic dominance, Japan expanded further into China and Southeast Asia, leading to widespread conflict. Major battles were fought across vast regions involving land, sea, and air forces on a scale never seen before in Japanese history. Soldiers faced harsh conditions and fierce resistance, while civilians experienced the disruptions and dangers of total war. The attack on Pearl Harbor brought Japan into direct conflict with the United States and its allies, expanding the war across the Pacific. Naval battles, aircraft carriers, and island campaigns became defining features of this conflict. The intensity of fighting and the scale of destruction were immense as both sides sought control of critical territories. At its height, the Japanese Empire controlled a vast area stretching across much of East and Southeast Asia. This expansion represented the peak of its power, but also stretched its resources thin, making it difficult to sustain control in the face of determined opposition. Daily life during this time was heavily influenced by the demands of war. Industries focused on military production, food was rationed, and people were mobilized to support the war effort. propaganda, and national unity were emphasized as the government sought to maintain morale during increasingly difficult conditions. Defeat, collapse, and the end of the Imperial era. As the war continued, the balance of power began to shift against Japan. Allied forces pushed back across the Pacific, reclaiming territory through a series of intense and costly battles. Island by island, the defensive lines of the empire were broken, and supply routes were cut, leaving Japanese forces isolated and struggling to hold their positions. The scale of destruction grew as cities were bombed and industries were targeted, weakening the nation's ability to continue the fight. Within Japan, daily life became increasingly difficult. Food shortages spread, and people endured long hours of labor under harsh conditions. Families were separated as soldiers remained at the front, and civilians faced the constant threat of air raids. The sense of uncertainty deepened as the war turned against the empire, and hope for victory faded. The final months of the conflict brought unprecedented devastation with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These events caused immense loss of life and destruction, and forced Japan to confront the reality that continuing the war would lead to even greater suffering. In a historic decision, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation, announcing Japan's surrender, marking the end of World War II and the collapse of the imperial system as it had existed. Occupation forces led by the United States entered Japan, overseeing a period of reconstruction and reform. The military was dismantled and a new constitution was introduced, transforming Japan into a nation committed to peace and democratic governance. The emperor remained, but in a symbolic role, no longer holding political power. This moment marked a profound turning point where centuries of imperial ambition and military rule came to an end, giving way to a new path focused on rebuilding and redefining national identity, rebuilding a nation and the birth of modern Japan. In the years following the war, Japan faced the enormous task of rebuilding its cities, economy, and society. Infrastructure had been destroyed, industries were weakened, and millions of people struggled to find stability. Yet through determination, cooperation, and external support, the country began a remarkable recovery. Reforms reshaped many aspects of life. Land was redistributed, giving farmers greater independence, and new labor laws improved working conditions. Education was expanded and modernized, creating opportunities for a new generation to learn and innovate. Women gained greater rights and participation in society, marking a shift toward a more inclusive system. Economic growth became the central focus as Japan invested in industry, technology, and trade. Factories were rebuilt with modern equipment, and companies developed efficient production methods that would later become models for the world. Exports increased, and Japanese goods gained a reputation for quality and reliability. Cities transformed once again as modern buildings, transportation networks, and communication systems were developed. High-speed trains connected regions, making travel faster and more efficient. Urban life expanded with new opportunities in business, education, and culture. Despite the hardships of the past, the people of Japan embraced a future defined by peace and progress. The lessons of war influenced national priorities, leading to a commitment to stability, cooperation, and economic development. Reflections, lessons, and the legacy of the empire. The story of the Japanese Empire is one of transformation, resilience, and complexity. From its beginnings in myth and early state formation to its rise as a powerful empire and its eventual downfall, it reflects the interplay of ambition, culture, conflict, and change. Each era contributed to shaping the identity of the nation, leaving behind lessons that continue to resonate. One of the most important lessons is the balance between tradition and adaptation. Japan's ability to adopt new ideas while preserving its cultural identity allowed it to grow and evolve across centuries. At the same time, the Experience of rapid expansion and conflict demonstrated the risks of unchecked ambition and the consequences of pursuing power without regard for others. The legacy of the empire can still be seen in modern Japan's cities, culture, and institutions. Historic temples, castles, and towns stand alongside advanced technology and modern infrastructure, creating a unique blend of past and present. Cultural practices developed over centuries continue to influence art, food, and daily life, while historical events shape national memory and identity. Today, Japan is known not as an empire of conquest, but as a nation of innovation, peace, and global engagement. Its journey from isolation to expansion to reconstruction offers insight into how societies can change and adapt even after facing profound challenges. As the story concludes, the voices of the past remain present in the landscapes, traditions, and people of Japan, reminding us that history is not only a record of events, but a living influence that shapes the world we see today. The sacred origins and the world of myth and nature. In the earliest telling of Japan's story, the land itself is born from divine creation, and the islands rise from the sea through the actions of gods whose presence fills the mountains, rivers, forests, and sky. These stories were not simply tales, but a way of understanding the world and the place of people within it. The sun goddess Amaterasu stood at the center of this belief system, and from her lineage came the imperial line, beginning with the legendary Emperor Jimmu, whose journey is said to have marked the founding of the nation. In this sacred landscape, every natural element held meaning. Trees were believed to house spirits, stones could be vessels of divine presence, and waterfalls carried both physical and spiritual power. Early communities lived in close connection with this environment, shaping their daily lives around seasonal changes and natural cycles. Rituals were performed to honor these forces and to seek protection, guidance, and prosperity. Life in these early times was simple, yet deeply connected to survival and belief. People built dwellings from wood and thatch, often raised slightly above the ground to protect against moisture and pests. Villages were small and closely knit, with families working together to gather food, fish in rivers and seas, and hunt in the forests. The rhythm of life was dictated by nature, with planting, harvesting, and migration following patterns passed down through generations. Food was gathered from both land and sea, including fish, shellfish, wild plants, nuts, and fruits. Over time, the introduction of rice cultivation transformed society, allowing for more stable food production and the growth of larger communities. Rice became more than sustenance. It became a symbol of wealth, power, and spiritual importance, used in rituals and offerings to the gods. These early societies did not see a sharp divide between the physical and spiritual worlds. Instead, they believed that unseen forces moved through all things, shaping events and influencing outcomes. Leaders often held both political and spiritual roles, acting as intermediaries between the people and the divine. This blend of governance and belief created a foundation for authority that would carry into later periods of Japanese history. The Jomon world and the first people of the islands. Long before the formation of a unified state, the islands of Japan were home to the Jomon people, whose culture stretched back thousands of years. They were among the earliest known inhabitants, and their way of life offers a glimpse into a world shaped by adaptation, creativity, and resilience. The Jomon people were primarily hunter-gatherers, but they lived in a way that was more settled than many other groups of their time. They built pit dwellings partially dug into the earth, providing insulation against cold weather and protection from the elements. These homes were arranged in small communities, often located near rivers, forests, and coastlines where resources were abundant. One of the most remarkable aspects of Jomon culture was their pottery. They created intricate clay vessels decorated with cord-like patterns, giving the period its name, which means cord-marked. These pots were used for cooking, storage, and ritual purposes, and they reveal a high level of artistic expression even in a society focused on survival. Daily life involved a range of activities from fishing with nets and hooks to hunting animals such as deer and boar. Gathering plants, nuts, and berries supplemented their diet, providing a balanced and varied source of nutrition. Tools were made from stone, bone, and wood, crafted with skill and adapted for specific tasks. Social structures were likely based on kinship, with small groups cooperating for mutual benefit. There is evidence of trade between communities, as materials such as obsidian were transported across distances, indicating connections beyond immediate settlements. Ritual objects and figurines suggest that spiritual beliefs played an important role in their lives, possibly connected to fertility, nature, and protection. Despite the challenges of their environment, the Jomon people created a stable and enduring culture that lasted for thousands of years. Their legacy can still be seen in archaeological sites and artifacts that tell the story of a people deeply connected to their land and capable of remarkable creativity. The Yayoi transformation and the seeds of power. The arrival of new peoples and ideas during the Yayoi period brought profound changes that would reshape the islands and set the stage for the rise of the Japanese state. This era saw the introduction of wet rice agriculture, a development that transformed both the landscape and the structure of society. Rice cultivation required coordination, planning, and labor, leading to the formation of larger and more organized communities. Fields were carefully prepared with irrigation systems that controlled the flow of water, ensuring successful harvests. This agricultural system created surplus food, which allowed populations to grow and supported the development of specialized roles within society. Metalworking also emerged during this time, with the use of bronze and iron tools and weapons. These technologies improved farming efficiency and introduced new forms of warfare. Communities began to fortify their settlements, building moats and defensive structures to protect against conflict with neighboring groups. Social hierarchy became more pronounced as leaders gained authority over resources and labor. These leaders often controlled access to rice and land, giving them significant influence. Burial practices from this period show differences in status, with some individuals interred with valuable goods, indicating the emergence of elite classes. Trade expanded both within the islands and with the mainland, bringing new ideas and cultural influences. Contacts with regions such as Korea and China introduced writing systems and elements of governance that would later shape the formation of the Japanese state. Daily life for the Yayoi people was more structured than before, with communities organized around agricultural cycles. Villages became centers of production and cooperation, where people worked together to cultivate fields and manage resources. Food became more consistent, with rice as a staple, supplemented by fish, vegetables, and other locally available foods. This transformation marked a shift from a primarily hunter-gatherer society to one based on agriculture hierarchy and emerging political structures. It laid the groundwork for the rise of powerful clans and the eventual unification of the islands under a centralized authority. The rise of clans and the path toward unity. As the Yayoi period gave way to the next stage of development, the islands of Japan became a patchwork of growing communities, each led by powerful clans that controlled land, resources, and people. These clans were not merely families, but complex networks of influence tied together by blood alliances and shared belief systems. Leadership within them was often hereditary and reinforced by both military strength and spiritual authority. Among these rising groups, the Yamato clan began to distinguish itself through its ability to form alliances and extend influence across regions. Rather than relying only on conquest, the Yamato leaders built relationships with other clans, offering protection, recognition, and shared identity. Over time, this network grew into a loose confederation that would eventually become the foundation of a unified state. The role of ritual and belief remained central during this period. Leaders claimed descent from divine ancestors, linking their authority to the sacred traditions that people deeply respected. Ceremonies were held to honor the gods and to legitimize power, reinforcing the idea that leadership was not just political, but also spiritual. This connection between ruler and divine origin would later define the imperial institution and give it lasting significance. Settlements continued to expand and evolve. Some grew into proto-urban centers where trade, governance, and craft production took place. Houses were built with increasing sophistication, and storage facilities were developed to manage surplus crops. Roads and pathways connected these communities, allowing goods and information to move more freely across the land. Conflict between clans was not uncommon as competition for resources and influence intensified. Skirmishes and small-scale battles shaped the political landscape, with victories leading to greater power and defeat, resulting in absorption or decline. Warriors during this time used simple but effective weapons such as spears, bows, and early iron swords, and their role in society began to grow in importance. The environment still played a defining role in daily life. People adapted to the varied geography of mountains, forests, and coastal plains, learning to cultivate land and use natural resources efficiently. Fishing remained a key source of food, especially in coastal areas, while inland communities relied heavily on agriculture. This era was one of transition, where the building blocks of a nation were being assembled through alliance belief and gradual consolidation of power. The rise of the Yamato clan signaled the beginning of a more unified political structure that would soon take clearer form. The Kofun period and the symbols of power. The emergence of the Kofun period brought with it visible signs of growing authority and social hierarchy, most notably in the construction of massive burial mounds known as Kofun. These structures, shaped like keyholes when viewed from above, were built for powerful leaders and served as both tombs and symbols of status. Their scale and complexity reflected the resources and labor that these leaders could command, demonstrating the increasing organization of society. Inside these burial mounds, archaeologists have found a variety of objects, including weapons, armor mirrors, and jewelry, indicating both the wealth of the elite and the importance of ritual in honoring the dead. Clay figures known as haniwa were placed around the tombs, depicting warriors, animals, and everyday scenes, offering insight into the lives and beliefs of the time. The Yamato rulers continued to expand their influence during this period, gradually asserting dominance over other clans. They established a more defined court system with ranks and titles that organized leadership and administration. This early form of governance laid the groundwork for a centralized state, even though power was still distributed among regional leaders. Contact with the Asian mainland became more frequent, bringing new technologies, ideas, and cultural practices. Skilled artisans, migrants, and scholars contributed to developments in metalworking, writing, and governance. These exchanges helped accelerate the growth of the Yamato state and connected it to a broader regional network. Daily life for common people remained focused on agriculture and local production. Villages were organized around fields and water sources, with families working together to ensure survival and prosperity. Tools improved and techniques became more refined, increasing efficiency and supporting population growth. The distinction between social classes became more pronounced, with elites enjoying privileges and resources not available to ordinary people. This stratification was reflected in burial practices, housing, and access to goods, reinforcing a hierarchy that would continue to develop in later periods. The Kofun period represents a time when power became more visible, more structured, and more enduring. The monumental tombs stand as lasting reminders. of leaders who shaped the early direction of Japan and whose influence extended beyond their lifetimes. The Asuka period and the birth of a true state. The transition into the Asuka period marked a significant step toward the creation of a more formal and centralized state. During this time, the Yamato court adopted new systems of governance inspired by models from China, particularly those of the Sui and Tang dynasties. These systems introduced structured bureaucracy, legal codes, and administrative divisions that allowed for more effective control over the land and its people. One of the most transformative developments of this era was the official introduction and promotion of Buddhism. Temples were constructed and supported by the state, becoming centers of learning, culture, and political influence. Buddhism coexisted with traditional Shinto beliefs, creating a complex spiritual landscape that shaped both public and private life. Leaders such as Prince Shotoku played a crucial role in guiding these changes. He is remembered for promoting a constitution that emphasized moral governance, harmony, and respect for authority. His efforts helped lay the intellectual and political foundation for a more organized and principled system of rule. The capital during this time became a focal point of activity where government officials, religious leaders, and nobles gathered to manage the affairs of the state. Buildings were designed with increasing sophistication, reflecting influences from the mainland and symbolizing the growing power of the court. Education and literacy began to spread among the elite, as Chinese characters were adopted for writing, allowing for record-keeping, communication, and the preservation of knowledge. This development marked a major step in the cultural and administrative advancement of Japan. Daily life for majority of people still revolved around agriculture, but they were now part of a more structured system that connected local communities to the central government. Taxes, labor obligations, and laws became more standardized, shaping the relationship between rulers and the ruled. The Asuka period represents the moment when Japan began to take on the characteristics of a true state, with defined institutions, shared cultural practices, and a centralized authority that could guide its future development. The Nara period and the first capital of power. As the structures of governance strengthened, the leaders of Japan sought to create a permanent capital that would reflect the order and authority of the state. This vision came to life in the city of Nara, which became the first true capital, built on a planned design inspired by the great cities of China. Wide streets were laid out in a grid pattern, and government buildings, temples, and residences were carefully arranged to symbolize harmony and control. The imperial court in Nara became the center of political, cultural, and religious life. Officials worked within a growing bureaucracy, managing taxation, law, and administration across the provinces. The emperor stood at the top of this system, supported by noble families who held key positions and influenced decisions. One of the most striking achievements of this era was the construction of grand Buddhist temples, including Todaiji, which housed a Chinyu bronze statue of the Buddha. These projects required enormous resources and labor, drawing people from across the country to contribute to their creation. The temples served not only as places of worship, but also as symbols of unity and spiritual protection for the nation. Daily life in Nara varied greatly depending on social status. Nobles lived in elegant compounds filled with art, music, and ceremony, while common people worked in fields or crafts supporting the economy. Markets bustled with activity as merchants traded goods ranging from food to textiles and tools. The presence of the capital attracted artisans and laborers, creating a vibrant urban environment. Transportation routes connected the capital to distant regions, allowing officials to travel and goods to move efficiently. Horses were used for official journeys, while boats carried supplies along rivers and coastlines. Communication relied on messengers who carried written documents, made possible by the growing use of literacy among the elite. However, the concentration of power and wealth in the capital also brought challenges. the influence of powerful Buddhist institutions began to grow, sometimes interfering with political decisions. Additionally, the burden of taxation and labor placed on the population created strain, leading to unrest in some areas. Despite these challenges, the Nara period established a model of centralized governance and cultural achievement that would influence future generations. It marked a high point in the early formation of the Japanese state, where power belief and organization came together in a visible and lasting way. The Heian period and the world of courtly elegance. Following the Nara period, the capital was moved to Heian-kyo, which is present-day Kyoto, ushering in an era of refined culture and artistic expression. The Heian period is often remembered as a golden age of courtly life, where elegance, sensitivity, and aesthetic beauty defined the values of the elite. The imperial court became a world of ritual poetry and subtle communication. Nobles expressed themselves through carefully crafted verses, and their ability to appreciate art, nature, and literature was considered a mark of sophistication. Clothing was elaborate, with layered robes in harmonious colors reflecting both status and personal taste. Among the most remarkable achievements of this period was the creation of literary works such as The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu. This narrative offers a detailed view of court life, exploring themes of love, ambition, and the passage of time. It is often considered one of the world's earliest novels and remains a cornerstone of Japanese literature. While the court thrived in its refined environment, real political power began to shift. Influential families such as the Fujiwara gained control by marrying into the imperial line and acting as regents, effectively guiding decisions behind the scenes. This system allowed them to maintain authority while preserving the image of imperial rule. Outside the capital, life was very different. Rural communities continued to focus on agriculture and local governance, with limited direct involvement from the court. Over time, regional leaders gained more independence, setting the stage for the rise of the warrior class. Religion continued to evolve during this era, with new forms of Buddhism spreading and influencing both elite and common people. Temples and shrines were built in scenic locations, blending architecture with natural beauty and reinforcing the connection between spirituality and the environment. Transportation and trade continued to support the economy, though the focus remained largely internal. Goods moved between regions, and the capital served as a hub for exchange and culture. The Heian period represents a peak of cultural refinement, but also a turning point where the seeds of future change were planted. The growing divide between the elegant court and the realities of regional power would eventually lead to the rise of a new era dominated by warriors. The decline of court power and the gathering of storms. As the Heian period moved toward its later years, the refined world of the court began to weaken under pressures that had been quietly building for generations. While nobles in the capital continued their rituals, poetry, and elegant lives, the provinces beyond their reach were changing in ways that could no longer be ignored. Land that had once been under direct control of the court was increasingly managed by private estates known as Shogun, which were held by powerful families, temples, and shrines. These estates often operated outside the authority of the central government, reducing its ability to collect taxes and enforce laws. With this shift came the rise of local leaders who needed to protect their lands from rivals and unrest. These leaders began to rely on armed retainers who would later be known as samurai. Unlike the court nobles, these warriors lived closer to the realities of conflict and survival. They trained with weapons, rode horses, and developed a culture based on loyalty, discipline, and readiness for battle. Two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, rose to prominence during this time, each gaining influence through military strength and connections to the court. At first, they served as protectors and enforcers, but over time, their ambitions grew. Rivalries intensified, and what had once been political maneuvering turned into open conflict. Life for common people during this period was marked by uncertainty. While some regions prospered, others faced instability as power shifted from distant nobles to local warlords. Farmers continued to work the land, but they now depended on the protection of those who could defend them. Markets still operated, and trade continued, but always under the shadow of potential conflict. The capital itself began to feel the effects of this instability. Fires, natural disasters, and political struggles created an atmosphere of decline. The elegance of court life remained, but it was increasingly detached from the realities shaping the rest of the country. This period was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation where the balance of power moved away from the court and toward those who could command loyalty and force. The stage was set for a dramatic shift that would change the structure of Japan and bring the age of warriors fully into power. The Genpei War and the fall of the old order. The tensions between the Taira and Minamoto clans eventually erupted into a full-scale conflict known as the Genpei War, a struggle that would decide the future of Japan. This war was fought across several years, with battles taking place in fields, mountains, and along the coast, involving thousands of warriors and shaping the fate of the nation. The Taira clan at first held significant power, controlling the court and placing their members in key positions. They enjoyed wealth, influence, and prestige, but their dominance also created resentment among rivals. The Minamoto clan, though weakened in earlier conflicts, rebuilt their strength and prepared to challenge the Taira for control. Battles during the Genpei War were intense and often dramatic. Warriors faced each other with bows, swords, and spears, calling out their names and lineage before engaging in combat. Honor and reputation were as important as victory, and stories of bravery, sacrifice, and tragedy became part of the cultural memory of Japan. One of the most decisive moments came at the naval battle of Dan no Yura, where the Minamoto forces defeated the Taira in a fierce confrontation on the sea. Ships clashed, arrows filled the air, and the tide of battle shifted with strategy and determination. The defeat of the Taira marked the end of their dominance and the collapse of the old court-centered order. In the aftermath, Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged as the most powerful leader, establishing a new system of governance based on military authority. The emperor remained, but real power shifted to the shogun, marking the beginning of a new era. For the people of Japan, this war brought both destruction and change. Villages were affected by the movement of armies and the demands of conflict, but it also led to a more stable structure under the new leadership. The Genpei War stands as a turning point where the elegant world of the Heian court gave way to the disciplined and martial society of the samurai. It was a moment of ending and beginning, where one era closed and another rose from its ashes. The establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate and a new order. With victory secured, Minamoto no Yoritomo established his government in Kamakura, creating the first shogunate and redefining the structure of power in Japan. This new system balanced the symbolic authority of the emperor with the practical control of the military government, creating a dual structure that would shape the country for centuries. The Kamakura shogunate relied on a network of loyal retainers who were granted land and authority in exchange for service. These warriors governed provinces, enforced laws, and maintained order, acting as the backbone of the new regime. Loyalty between lord and vassal became a defining feature of society, reinforced by mutual obligation and trust. Life during this time was shaped by discipline and practicality. The samurai class grew in importance, and their values influenced culture and behavior. Training in martial skills was essential, and education included both combat and moral instruction. Zen Buddhism gained popularity among warriors, offering a philosophy that emphasized focused simplicity and acceptance of life and death. Castles and fortified residences began to appear in strategic locations, providing protection and control over surrounding areas. These structures were not yet as elaborate as those of later periods, but they marked the beginning of a landscape shaped by defense and authority. Trade and agriculture continued to support the economy, though the focus was now on maintaining stability rather than expansion. Roads connected regions and goods moved between communities, allowing for steady development. Despite its strength, the Kamakura system faced challenges including internal conflicts and external threats such as the Mongol invasions. These events tested the resilience of the shogunate and required coordination and defense on a national scale. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate marked the full emergence of the warrior government, replacing the court-centered system of the past. It created a society where power was tied to military strength and loyalty, setting the pattern for the centuries that followed. The Mongol invasions and the defense of the islands. During the rule of the Kamakura shogunate, Japan faced one of its greatest external threats when the vast Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan turned its attention toward the islands. Having already conquered large parts of Asia, the Mongols demanded that Japan submit to their authority. When these demands were rejected, preparations began for invasion, setting the stage for a dramatic and defining moment in Japanese history. The first invasion came in the late 13th century when a combined force of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops crossed the sea and landed on the shores of Ieyasu. Their methods of warfare were different from those of the Japanese warriors, using coordinated formations, explosive weapons, and disciplined tactics. The samurai, who were used to individual combat and displays of personal valor, found themselves facing an unfamiliar and formidable enemy. Battles were fierce and chaotic as defenders struggled to adapt to the new style of fighting. Despite the strength of the invading force, the campaign was cut short when a powerful storm struck the fleet, destroying many ships and forcing the survivors to retreat. This event was later remembered as a divine wind believed to be sent by the gods to protect the land. Several years later, a second and much larger invasion force arrived, determined to succeed where the first had failed. By this time, the Japanese had prepared defenses, including coastal fortifications and improved coordination among their forces. The invaders again landed, and intense fighting followed with heavy losses on both sides. Once again, nature intervened as a massive typhoon swept through the region, devastating the invading fleet and ending the campaign. The storms reinforced the belief that the islands were protected by divine forces and strengthened the resolve of the people. However, the cost of defense was high. The prolonged effort strained the resources of the Kamakura government, and many warriors who had fought bravely received little reward since no new lands were gained. This dissatisfaction weakened loyalty and contributed to internal instability. The Mongol invasions became a symbol of resilience and survival, but they also exposed vulnerabilities within the system. They marked both a moment of triumph and the beginning of challenges that would eventually lead to the decline of the Kamakura shogunate. The fall of Kamakura and the struggle for control. In the years following the Mongol invasions, the Kamakura shogunate faced increasing internal conflict. The strain on resources and dissatisfaction among the samurai class weakened the bonds that had held the system together. Rival factions within the government competed for influence and authority, creating instability at the highest levels of power. At the same time, the imperial court sought to regain control and restore its authority. Emperor Go-Daigo emerged as a determined figure who challenged the dominance of the shogunate and attempted to reassert direct rule. His efforts led to a period of conflict that shook the foundations of the existing order. Alliances shifted as powerful warriors chose sides in the struggle between the court and the shogunate. Among them was Ashikaga Takauji, who initially supported the emperor, but later turned against him, establishing his own power base. Battles erupted across the country as forces clashed in a fight for supremacy. The Kamakura shogunate eventually fell, unable to withstand the combined pressures of internal division and external challenge. Its collapse marked the end of the first warrior government and opened a new chapter of uncertainty and conflict. The brief restoration of imperial rule that followed was short-lived, as competing interests and ambitions quickly led to further division. The country entered a period where authority was contested and stability remained elusive. For ordinary people, this time brought renewed hardship as conflict disrupted agriculture, trade, and daily life. Villages were affected by shifting control and the demands of competing armies. Yet even in this turmoil, communities continued to adapt and survive, finding ways to maintain their livelihoods. The fall of Kamakura was not just the end of a sass, but a transition into a new phase where the struggle for power would continue shaping the future of Japan, the Ashikaga shogunate, and a fractured realm. Following the collapse of Kamakura, a new shogunate was established under Ashikaga Takauji, marking the beginning of the Muromachi period. This government was based in Kyoto, bringing the center of military power closer to the imperial court, but also creating a complex relationship between the two. The Ashikaga shogunate sought to restore order, but faced significant challenges in maintaining control over powerful regional lords. Authority was less centralized than before, and many daimyo operated with considerable independence, managing their own territories and forces. This decentralization made the political landscape more fragile and prone to conflict. Despite these challenges, the period saw important cultural developments. The arts flourished with the growth of practices such as tea ceremony, ink painting, and no theater. Zen Buddhism continued to influence both culture and philosophy, emphasizing simplicity, discipline, and mindfulness. Trade expanded during this time, including exchanges with China and other parts of Asia, bringing goods, ideas, and economic opportunities. Ports became centers of activity where merchants and sailors connected Japan to broader networks. However, political instability persisted and eventually escalated into the Onin War, a devastating conflict that destroyed much of Kyoto and marked the beginning of the Sengoku period. This war involved rival factions fighting for control and led to widespread chaos across the Saichi. Daily life during this era varied greatly depending on location. Some regions experienced growth and cultural richness, while others faced constant warfare and uncertainty. Castles became more prominent as leaders fortified their positions and prepared for ongoing Meiji. The Ashikaga period represents a time of both cultural brilliance and political fragmentation, where achievements in art and thought existed alongside instability and conflict. It set the stage for the age of warring states, where the struggle for power would reach new intensity. The Sengoku era and the world in endless war. As the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate weakened, the land descended into a prolonged period of conflict known as the Sengoku era, a time when no single power could control the whole country and when ambition drove countless lords to seek dominance. The Onin War had shattered what remained of centralized authority, leaving Kyoto in ruins and opening the way for regional warlords to rise independently. Across the islands, daimyo built their own domains, strengthening castles, training armies, and forging alliances that could shift at any moment. These leaders ruled with a mix of force and strategy, rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal. Their territories became small states with their own systems of governance, taxation, and defense. Castles during this era evolved into complex fortresses, often built on hills or mountains to provide strategic advantage. High stone walls, deep moats and layered defenses made them difficult to capture. Around these castles grew towns filled with merchants, artisans, and farmers who supported the needs of the ruling lord and his army. These castle towns became centers of economic and social life even as war raged around them. Armies grew larger and more organized. Soldiers were trained not only as individual warriors but as units capable of coordinated movement on the battlefield. The introduction of firearms, brought by Portuguese traders, changed warfare significantly, allowing for new tactics that combined traditional weapons with gunpowder technology. Battles became louder, more chaotic, and more deadly as volleys of gunfire mixed with the clash of swords and spears. Daily life for common people was shaped by the demands of constant war. Farmers worked their fields while remaining ready to flee or defend their homes. Merchants adapted to shifting markets and risks, while artisans produced weapons armor and supplies needed for campaigns. Despite the instability, communities continued to function, showing resilience in the face of uncertainty. This era was not only about destruction, but also about innovation. Leaders experimented with new methods of administration, military organization, and economic management. Some domains prospered by encouraging trade and agriculture, creating a foundation for future stability. The Sengoku era represents one of the most intense and transformative periods in Japanese history, where the struggle for power reshaped society and prepared the way for eventual unification. Oda Nobunaga and the drive toward unification. Among the many daimyo of the Sengoku era, one figure stood out for his ambition, vision, and ruthless determination: Oda Nobunaga. Rising from a relatively modest domain, he used innovative tactics and bold strategies to defeat his rivals and expand his influence rapidly. Nobunaga embraced new technologies, especially firearms, integrating them into his armies in ways that gave him a decisive advantage. He organized his forces with discipline and efficiency, breaking from older traditions of warfare and focusing on practical results. His victories in key battles demonstrated the effectiveness of his approach and established him as a dominant power. He also sought to weaken institutions that opposed his authority, including powerful religious groups that controlled large territories and armies of their own. His campaigns against these forces were often harsh, reflecting his determination to eliminate any obstacle to unification. Under his leadership, castle towns grew and economic activity increased. He encouraged trade, reduced barriers, and supported the development of markets, creating a more dynamic and interconnected economy. Roads improved, and communication between regions became more efficient, supporting both military and commercial needs. Despite his success, Nobunaga's rule was cut short by betrayal when one of his own generals turned against him, leading to his death. Yet his impact was profound, as he had broken the power of many rivals and set the stage for the final steps toward unification. His life is remembered as a turning point where bold vision and decisive action began to bring an end to the chaos of the Sengoku era. Toyotomi Hideyoshi and the completion of unity. Following the death of Nobunaga, his loyal general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rose to power, continuing the mission of unifying Japan. Unlike many other leaders, Hideyoshi came from humble origins, rising through talent, intelligence, and determination to become the most powerful figure in the land. Hideyoshi combined military strength with political skill, forging alliances and consolidating control over remaining independent domains. Through a series of campaigns, he brought nearly all of Japan under his authority, achieving what had seemed impossible during the height of the Sengoku era. He introduced reforms that helped stabilize society, including land surveys and regulations that clarified ownership and responsibilities. He also enforced a separation between classes, restricting the carrying of weapons to the samurai and ensuring that farmers remained focused on agriculture. These measures reduced the likelihood of rebellion and created a more orderly system. Under his rule, castle construction continued, and cities grew as centers of administration and culture. Trade flourished both within Japan and with foreign partners, bringing wealth and new ideas. Food production increased, supporting a growing population and contributing to overall stability. Despite his success in unifying the country, Hideyoshi sought to extend his influence beyond Japan, launching invasions of Korea. These campaigns were ambitious and costly, involving large armies and complex logistics. While they demonstrated Japan's military strength, they ultimately failed to achieve lasting success and placed a heavy burden on resources. Hideyoshi's leadership marked the near completion of unification and the transition from chaos to order. His achievements created the conditions for a lasting peace that would soon be realized under his successor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and the birth of lasting peace. After the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the fragile unity of Japan once again faced uncertainty as rival factions positioned themselves for control. Among them, Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged as a patient and calculating leader who had spent years building alliances and strengthening his domain. His opportunity came at the decisive Battle of Sekigahara, where forces from across the country gathered in a massive confrontation that would determine the future of Japan. The battle unfolded across mist-covered fields as thousands of soldiers faced one another in a struggle of strategy, loyalty, and timing. Ieyasu's forces held firm, and key defections among his opponents shifted the balance in his favor. By the end of the conflict, he stood victorious, securing his position as the most powerful leader in the land. With this victory, Ieyasu established the Tokugawa Shogunate, creating a government that would bring stability after centuries of war. He chose Edo as his base, transforming it into a center of administration and power. Over time, this city would grow into a vast urban center, reflecting the strength and organization of the new regime. The Tokugawa system was built on careful control. Daimyo were required to maintain loyalty through systems that ensured their dependence on the shogunate, including alternating residence between their domains and Edo. This reduced the likelihood of rebellion and kept regional leaders closely tied to the central authority. Peace allowed society to shift from constant warfare to development and order. Samurai adapted to new roles as administrators and officials while maintaining their identity as a warrior class. Farmers focused on agriculture, producing the rice that supported the economy, and artisans and merchants contributed to growing urban life. Daily life became more predictable and structured. Roads connected regions and travel increased, allowing people to move for work, trade, and pilgrimage. Markets expanded and goods flowed steadily, creating a more integrated economy. Food culture developed with regional specialties and urban dining becoming more common. The establishment of Tokugawa rule marked the end of the Sengoku era and the beginning of a long period of peace that would shape Japan's culture, society, and identity for generations. Life in Edo and the culture of a peaceful society. As the Tokugawa period progressed, the city of Edo grew into one of the largest cities in the world, filled with people from all walks of life. Samurai lived in designated districts serving their lords or the shogunate, while merchants and artisans occupied bustling neighborhoods filled with shops, workshops, and entertainment. The structure of society remained strict with clear divisions between classes, yet within these boundaries, a vibrant culture developed. The merchant class, though officially low in status, accumulated wealth and became patrons of the arts, supporting theaters, literature, and visual culture. Kabuki theater emerged as a popular form of entertainment, drawing crowds with dramatic performances, colorful costumes, and expressive storytelling. Woodblock prints known as ukiyo captured scenes of daily life landscapes and famous actors, providing both art and a form of mass communication. Transportation networks such as the Tokaido Road connected Edo to Kyoto and other major regions, allowing travelers to move between cities. Inns along these routes provided rest and food, creating a culture of travel that included pilgrims, merchants, and officials. Journeys that once took weeks became more organized and accessible. Food culture flourished in the cities with street vendors and small restaurants offering a variety of dishes. Rice remained a staple, but meals also included fish, vegetables, noodles, and pickled items. Urban life created demand for convenience and variety, leading to the development of new culinary traditions. Despite the outward stability challenges existed, natural disasters such as fires, earthquakes, and floods periodically disrupted life in the crowded city. Economic pressures and social tensions also arose as wealth became concentrated among merchants, while samurai often faced financial difficulties. Yet the overall sense of order and continuity allowed people to build lives, plan for the future, and engage in cultural pursuits. This era of peace created a distinct identity that balanced discipline, tradition, and creativity, leaving a lasting impression on Japanese society. Isolation, stability, and the quiet transformation of a nation. The Tokugawa government maintained a policy of limited contact with the outside world, controlling foreign trade and restricting travel abroad. This approach aimed to preserve stability and prevent external influences from disrupting the carefully managed social order. While this isolation limited direct interaction with other nations, it did not completely cut Japan off from global developments. Select trade continued through designated ports, allowing the exchange of goods and knowledge. Scholars studied foreign texts, gaining insights into science, medicine, and technology that would later prove valuable. Within the country, gradual changes took place. Agricultural techniques improved, increasing productivity and supporting population growth. Markets expanded, and a monetary economy developed alongside traditional rice-based systems. Education spread through schools and private academies, raising literacy levels among both samurai and common people. Cities continued to grow, and regional specialization developed, with different areas producing goods suited to their resources and skills. Trade networks connected these regions, creating a dynamic internal economy even without extensive foreign interaction. Social structure remained rigid, but cracks began to appear as economic realities challenged traditional hierarchies. Merchants gained influence through wealth, while some samurai struggled to maintain their status. These shifts created subtle tensions that would eventually contribute to larger changes. This period of relative quiet was not stagnant, but rather a time of steady transformation beneath the surface. The foundations of a modern society were being laid, even as the outward appearance remained rooted in tradition. The long peace of the Tokugawa era prepared Japan for the dramatic changes that would come when the outside world forced its way back into the nation's affairs. The Black Ships and the end of isolation. For more than 2 centuries, Japan had maintained careful control over its borders, preserving stability through limited contact with the outside world. This balance was broken in the mid-19th century when foreign powers arrived with advanced technology and demands that could not be ignored. The most dramatic moment came when a fleet of American warships appeared off the coast, their dark hulls and smoke-filled engines earning them the name Black Ships among the people who saw them. These ships carried a message that Japan must open its ports to trade and establish diplomatic relations. The display of power made clear that refusal could lead to conflict, and the Tokugawa government found itself facing a challenge unlike any it had encountered before. After careful consideration and internal debate, agreements were made, allowing limited trade and contact with foreign nations. The opening of Japan created a wave of change that spread rapidly through society. New goods, technologies, and ideas entered the country, challenging long-held traditions and beliefs. Some welcomed these changes, seeing them as opportunities for growth and strength, while others feared the loss of identity and control. Political tensions increased as different groups argued over the future of the nation. Some supported the continuation of the shogunate, while others called for the restoration of imperial rule and a new direction. This conflict weakened the existing government and set the stage for a dramatic transformation. In cities and towns, people began to see unfamiliar sights, such as foreign clothing machines and ships. Markets offered new products, and knowledge of the wider world expanded. The sense of isolation that had defined the Tokugawa era gave way to curiosity, uncertainty, and ambition. The arrival of the black ships marked not just the end of isolation, but the beginning of a new chapter where Japan would be forced to adapt quickly to a rapidly changing global environment. The Meiji Restoration and the rebirth of imperial power. As tensions grew, the Tokugawa shogunate lost its ability to maintain control, and a movement emerged to restore power to the emperor. This movement succeeded in what became known as the Meiji Restoration, a turning point that reshaped Japan's political and social structure. The emperor, once a largely symbolic figure, became the center of authority as reformers sought to unify the country under a modern government. The capital was moved to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, marking a shift in both geography and identity. Leaders of the new government recognized the need to strengthen Japan to avoid domination by foreign powers. They embarked on an ambitious program of modernization, drawing inspiration from Western nations. Railways were built connecting distant regions. Factories were established to produce goods, and a modern military was created using advanced training and equipment. Education became a priority, with new schools teaching science, mathematics, and foreign languages alongside traditional subjects. Students were sent abroad to learn from other countries and bring back knowledge that could be applied at home. Daily life changed rapidly as people adapted to new systems and opportunities. Traditional clothing gradually gave way to Western styles in some settings, and architecture evolved to include new materials and designs. Communication improved with telegraph lines and newspapers spreading information more quickly than ever before. While these changes brought progress, they also created challenges. Rapid transformation required adjustment, and not everyone benefited equally. Some struggled to adapt to new roles, while others embraced the possibilities of a modernizing society. The Meiji Restoration marked the rebirth of Japan as a unified and forward-looking nation, setting the stage for its emergence as a powerful force on the global stage. Industrial growth and the emergence of a modern nation. Following the reforms of the Meiji era, Japan entered a period of intense industrial growth that transformed its economy and society. Factories rose in cities producing textiles, machinery, and later, more complex goods. Steam engines powered transportation and production, linking regions and increasing efficiency. Railways expanded across the country, reducing travel time and connecting markets. Ports were modernized to handle increased trade, and ships carried Japanese goods to international destinations. This growth allowed the nation to compete economically with established powers and gain recognition on the world stage. Urbanization accelerated as people moved from rural areas to cities in search of work. New neighborhoods formed around industrial centers, creating diverse communities with changing lifestyles. Daily routines shifted from agricultural cycles to factory schedules, introducing new rhythms and challenges. Food and culture adapted to these changes. While traditional meals remained important, urban populations began to experience greater variety influenced by trade and innovation. Markets and restaurants offered new choices reflecting the evolving tastes of society. The government played a key role in guiding this growth, investing in infrastructure and supporting industries. Over time, private companies expanded, taking on a larger role in the economy and driving further development. education continued to expand, creating a skilled workforce capable of supporting technological advancement. Literacy increased, and access to knowledge allowed more people to participate in the nation's progress. This era of industrialization laid the foundation for Japan's rise as a modern nation capable of both economic and military strength. It represented a shift from a traditional society to one deeply connected to global systems of trade and innovation. The first steps of expansion and the road to empire. As Japan grew stronger through modernization and industrial progress, its leaders began to look beyond the islands with a new sense of purpose and ambition. The desire for resources, security, and recognition drove the nation to engage more directly with its neighbors. This marked the beginning of Japan's transformation from a developing state into an expanding empire. One of the earliest major conflicts of this new era was the war with China over influence in Korea. Korea held strategic importance as both a neighboring region and a gateway to the mainland. The conflict tested Japan's modern military and demonstrated how far it had advanced. With disciplined forces, advanced weapons, and organized command, Japan achieved victory, gaining influence and recognition as a rising power. This success was followed by another significant conflict with Russia, a major empire with its own ambitions in East Asia. The war between Japan and Russia was closely watched by the world as it challenged the assumption that Western powers could not be defeated by an Asian nation. Through careful strategy, strong leadership, and determined effort, Japan secured victory, marking a historic moment that reshaped global perceptions. These victories allowed Japan to expand its control over territories such as Taiwan and Korea. Administration of these regions required new systems of governance infrastructure and military presence. Railways were built, ports were developed, and institutions were established to manage resources and maintain order. However, expansion also brought challenges. Local populations often resisted foreign rule, creating tensions that required constant management. Cultural differences, economic demands, and political pressures made governance complex and sometimes unstable. Back in Japan, the effects of expansion were visible in growing industries, increased trade, and a stronger sense of national identity. People took pride in the nation's achievements and its rising status among world powers. At the same time, the demands of maintaining an empire placed increasing strain on resources and decision-making. This period marked the true beginning of Japan as an empire extending its reach beyond its original borders and stepping onto the global stage with confidence and determination. Life in the colonies and the structure of imperial rule. As Japan expanded into new territories, it established systems of governance designed to integrate these regions into the empire. Each colony had its own unique characteristics, but all were shaped by the policies and priorities of the imperial government. In Taiwan, administrators focused on developing infrastructure, including railways, roads, and ports to facilitate trade and movement. Agricultural production was expanded, and efforts were made to improve public health and education. These changes brought both development and control, as local systems were reorganized under Japanese authority. In Korea, the process was more complex and often more tense. The administration sought to modernize industry and infrastructure while also enforcing policies that aimed to align the region more closely with Japanese culture and governance. Schools, institutions, and economic systems were restructured, creating both opportunities and resistance among the population. Daily life in these colonies varied widely. Some people found new economic opportunities while others faced restrictions and challenges. Cities grew as centers of administration and trade, with buildings reflecting a blend of local and Japanese styles. Markets offered goods from across the empire, and transportation networks connected regions more efficiently than before. Officials appointed to govern these areas were responsible for maintaining order, implementing policy, and managing resources. Their roles required balancing the goals of the empire with the realities on the ground, often leading to difficult decisions and complex outcomes. Trade within the empire increased as resources from the colonies supported industries in Japan, while manufactured goods flowed back into these regions. This interconnected system strengthened the overall economy, but also highlighted inequalities in how resources were distributed and used. The experience of empire was not uniform. It brought growth, change, and connection, but also tension and struggle, shaping the lives of millions across different regions. The growth of military power and the approach of global conflict. As Japan's empire expanded, its military became increasingly central to national policy and identity. The army and navy grew in size and capability, supported by industrial production and technological advancement. Training emphasized discipline, loyalty, and readiness, preparing forces for both defense and expansion. Leaders began to see military strength as essential to securing resources and protecting the nation's interests. This perspective led to greater involvement in regional conflicts, particularly in China, where competition for influence intensified. Campaigns extended into large areas, bringing Japan into prolonged engagement that required significant resources and coordination. At the same time, global tensions were rising as major powers competed for influence and territory. Alliances shifted, and the world moved toward a period of widespread conflict. Japan's position within this landscape became increasingly complex as it balanced its ambitions with the realities of international relations. Daily life within Japan reflected the growing importance of the military. Industries focused on production that supported armed forces, and education emphasized national unity and duty. Young men were trained for service, and the idea of sacrifice for the nation became a powerful theme. Cities continued to grow and modernize, but there was also a sense of preparation and expectation as the possibility of larger conflict loomed. Communication and transportation networks were strengthened to support rapid mobilization and coordination. This period marked the buildup to a defining moment in global history, where Japan's ambitions and the shifting balance of power would lead to large-scale conflict. The choices made during this time would have lasting consequences, shaping not only the future of the empire but the world as a whole. The road to the Pacific War and the gathering storm. As tensions deepened across Asia and the wider world, Japan found itself increasingly drawn into a path that would lead to total war. The ongoing conflict in China had already stretched resources and tested the limits of the empire, yet leaders believed that securing access to vital materials, such as oil, rubber, and metals, was essential for survival and strength. Diplomatic relations with Western powers became strained as expansion into Southeast Asia brought Japan into direct conflict with their interests. Economic pressure mounted as restrictions were placed on trade, limiting access to critical supplies. These actions were seen by Japanese leadership as threats to national security and independence. Within government and military circles, debates intensified between those who sought negotiation and those who believed decisive action was necessary. Over time, the latter view gained dominance, shaping the course of events that followed. Plans were developed for a bold and risky strategy aimed at neutralizing opposition quickly and securing a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The idea was to strike fast, capture key territories, and force opponents into a position where negotiation would favor Japan. This strategy required coordination across vast distances involving naval fleets, air power, and ground forces in a scale never before attempted by the empire. Training intensified as soldiers, sailors, and pilots prepared for the coming conflict. New technologies were integrated into military operations, including aircraft carriers, advanced planes, and improved communication systems. The sense of urgency grew as the nation moved closer to war, knowing that the outcome would determine its future. For ordinary people, life began to shift toward a wartime footing. Industries increased production to support the military, and resources were carefully managed. Propaganda emphasized unity, duty, and sacrifice, preparing the population for the challenges ahead. The stage was set for a conflict that would span oceans and continents, bringing unprecedented scale and intensity to the Japanese Empire's ambitions. The opening strikes and the expansion across the Pacific. The war began with a sudden and coordinated series of attacks designed to achieve maximum impact in a short time. The most famous of these was the strike on Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States directly into the conflict. Aircraft launched from carriers flew across the ocean and struck with precision, targeting ships and installations in a dramatic and shocking assault. At the same time, Japanese forces moved rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, capturing territories that provided access to resources and strategic positions. Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and parts of Indonesia fell in quick succession as coordinated land, sea, and air operations overwhelmed defenses. The speed of these advances surprised many and demonstrated the effectiveness of Japan's early war strategy. Naval power played a central role in these operations. Carrier groups moved across vast distances, launching aircraft that could strike far beyond the range of traditional fleets. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers supported these efforts, protecting supply lines and engaging enemy forces when necessary. On land, soldiers advanced through jungles, mountains, and coastal regions, facing both environmental challenges and determined resistance. Logistics became critical as supplies had to be transported across difficult terrain and long distances. Despite these challenges, the early phase of the war saw Japan at the height of its expansion, controlling a vast area across Asia and the Pacific. For the people within these newly occupied territories, life changed rapidly. Military administration replaced previous governments and resources were directed towards supporting the war effort. While some initially saw Japan as a force that might challenge Western colonial rule, the realities of occupation often brought hardship and tension. Back in Japan, the early successes were celebrated and reinforced a sense of confidence in the nation's strength. However, beneath this confidence lay the growing complexity of managing such a vast empire and the challenges that would soon emerge as the war continued. Turning points and the shift of momentum. As the war progressed, the initial advantage held by Japan began to erode. Allied forces reorganized and launched counteroffensives that challenged Japanese control across the Pacific. One of the most significant turning points came with the Battle of Midway, where a decisive naval engagement resulted in the loss of key Japanese aircraft carriers and experienced pilots. This battle marked a shift in momentum that would influence the remainder of the war. Following this turning point, a series of intense campaigns unfolded as Allied forces advanced through island chains in what became known as island hopping. Each location presented unique challenges with fortified positions, difficult terrain, and determined defenders. Battles were fought with extraordinary intensity as both sides committed significant resources and manpower. Supply lines became increasingly strained for Japan as its forces were spread across a vast area. Allied control of the sea and air disrupted the movement of supplies, making it difficult to reinforce and sustain distant positions. This gradual weakening affected both military capability and morale. Technology and industrial capacity played a growing role in the conflict. The ability of the United States and its allies to produce ships, aircraft, and equipment on a large scale began to outpace Japan's capacity. This imbalance made it harder for Japan to replace losses and maintain its defensive perimeter. For soldiers on the front lines, conditions were often harsh with limited supplies and constant fighting took place in jungles, mountains, and small islands where every advantage had to be earned through effort and sacrifice. The determination of these forces became a defining feature of the war, even as the overall situation grew more difficult. The shift in momentum did not happen suddenly, but through a series of battles and decisions that gradually changed the balance of power. By the later stages of the conflict, it became clear that the empire was facing a challenge that would test its limits. The final phase and the end of the war. In the closing years of the war, Allied forces moved closer to the Japanese home islands, bringing the conflict to an increasingly critical stage. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted cities and industrial centers, causing widespread destruction and further weakening the nation's ability to sustain the war effort. Naval and air superiority allowed Allied forces to isolate Japan, cutting off supply routes and limiting movement. Battles such as those fought on islands near the mainland demonstrated the intensity of the final phase, with heavy losses on both sides and fierce resistance from defenders. As conditions worsened within Japan, daily life became extremely difficult. Food shortages increased, and many people faced hardship as resources were directed toward the war. The constant threat of air raids created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, affecting communities across the country. The war reached its most devastating moment with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, events that caused immense destruction and loss of life. These bombings, combined with the broader military situation, made it clear that continuing the conflict would lead to further catastrophe. In a historic decision, the emperor addressed the nation, announcing Japan's surrender, bringing an end to the war. This moment marked not only the conclusion of the conflict, but also the end of the Imperial era as it had been known. The aftermath required rebuilding, reflection, and change. The empire that had expanded across vast regions was gone, and Japan faced the task of redefining its future. Pearl Harbor, the strike that shook the world. In the early hours of a quiet morning, the waters of Hawaii lay calm, as ships rested in harbor and crews prepared for an ordinary day. Far out at sea, a Japanese carrier fleet moved in silence, its position carefully chosen and its mission planned with precision. Pilots had trained for months, studying maps, rehearsing maneuvers, and preparing themselves for a strike that would need to succeed in a single decisive blow. As dawn approached, aircraft were launched one after another, rising into the sky and forming groups that would descend upon their targets. The journey was long and tense, with each pilot aware that surprise was their greatest advantage. When they reached their destination, the harbor below came into view, filled with battleships, airfields, and facilities that represented the strength of the Pacific Fleet. The attack began suddenly, with the sound of engines and explosions breaking the morning calm. Bombs fell on ships anchored side by side, and torpedoes struck hulls below the waterline. Aircraft strafed airfields, destroying planes before they could take off. Smoke rose into the sky as fires spread and chaos replaced routine. Sailors rushed to their stations trying to respond, while others struggled to escape burning vessels or rescue their comrades. The assault came in waves, each carefully timed to maximize damage. Some ships were heavily damaged, others sank where they stood, and the harbor became a scene of destruction and urgency. Despite the shock, acts of courage were seen as crews fought to control fires, man guns, and aid the wounded. Within a short time, the attack was over, leaving behind a transformed landscape of smoke, wreckage, and loss. The strike achieved its goal of damaging the fleet, but it also had a deeper consequence, bringing the United States fully into the war and setting the stage for a conflict that would grow far beyond what had been imagined. The fall of Singapore and the Jungle Campaign. In Southeast Asia, Japanese forces moved with speed and coordination, advancing through the Malay Peninsula toward the heavily defended British stronghold of Singapore. The campaign challenged traditional expectations as Japanese troops advanced, not only along roads, but also through dense jungle terrain that many believed impassable. Soldiers carried light equipment, allowing them to move quickly and strike from unexpected directions. They used bicycles to travel long distances, conserving energy and maintaining momentum. This mobility gave them an advantage over defending forces who were often positioned based on assumptions about where attacks would come from. Battles unfolded along roads, rivers, and within the thick jungle where visibility was limited and conditions were harsh. Heat, humidity, and difficult terrain tested both sides. Japanese units coordinated artillery, infantry, and air support to overcome defenses, gradually pushing southward. As the campaign progressed, supply lines became critical. Moving food, ammunition, and medical supplies through the jungle required careful planning and adaptability. Despite these challenges, the advance continued with determination. When Japanese forces reached Singapore, the situation became increasingly desperate for the defenders. Bombing raids weakened infrastructure and water supplies were threatened. After days of intense fighting and dwindling resources, the decision was made to surrender, marking one of the most significant defeats for the British in the region. For those living in the area, the change was immediate. Military administration replaced previous authority, and daily life was reshaped under new conditions. The fall of Singapore demonstrated the effectiveness of Japan's early war strategy and its ability to challenge established powers. The Battle of Midway and the turning of the tide. Several months into the war, both sides prepared for a major naval confrontation that would take place near a small atoll known as Midway. Intelligence played a crucial role as American forces gained insight into Japanese plans, allowing them to position their fleet in anticipation of the attack. Japanese carriers launched aircraft to strike the island, aiming to draw out and destroy opposing forces. At the same time, American carriers waited beyond immediate detection, preparing their own response. The battle that followed unfolded across vast stretches of ocean, with aircraft traveling long distances to locate and engage targets. Timing and coordination became decisive factors. At a critical moment, American dive bombers located Japanese carriers while their decks were filled with fueled and armed aircraft. The attack that followed was swift and devastating, with bombs striking ships and causing fires that could not be contained. Within a short time, several carriers were heavily damaged and ultimately lost. Japanese pilots continued to fight with determination, launching counterattacks and engaging enemy aircraft in intense aerial combat. The sky became a chaotic arena where skill, courage, and chance determined survival. The loss of experienced pilots and key carriers dealt a severe blow to Japan's naval strength. While the battle did not end the war, it marked a turning point, shifting the balance of power and giving Allied forces the opportunity to move from defense to offense. For those involved, the battle was a test of endurance and decision-making, where moments of opportunity and error had lasting consequences. It stands as one of the most important naval engagements in history, shaping the course of the conflict that followed. Guadalcanal and the struggle for survival. The campaign for Guadalcanal marked the beginning of a prolonged and grueling series of battles as Allied forces sought to gain a foothold in the Pacific and challenge Japanese control. The island itself was covered in dense jungle, with a partially completed airfield that became the focal point of the siege. When Allied forces landed, they quickly secured the airfield, which would later be known as Henderson Field. From this position, aircraft could operate against Japanese supply lines and movements, making control of the island strategically vital. Japanese forces launched repeated attempts to retake the airfield, leading to fierce ground battles often fought at close range in difficult conditions. Soldiers faced not only enemy fire, but also disease, exhaustion, and limited supplies. Nights were filled with tension as attacks could come suddenly and without warning. Naval battles took place in the surrounding waters, with both sides attempting to control the sea routes that determine the flow of reinforcements and supplies. Ships engaged in nighttime combat where visibility was limited and decisions had to be made quickly. These encounters added another layer of intensity to the campaign. Air power played a constant role as aircraft from both sides engaged in dogfights and bombing runs. Control of the skies shifted over time, influencing the ability to sustain operations on the ground. The struggle for Guadalcanal lasted months with heavy losses on both sides. Eventually, Japanese forces were forced to withdraw, marking a significant step in the Allied advance. The campaign demonstrated the difficulty of offensive operations in the Pacific and the importance of logistics coordination and endurance. For those who fought there, the experience was one of constant challenge where survival depended on resilience and adaptability in an unforgiving environment. The Battle of Leyte Gulf and the clash of great fleets. As Allied forces moved to retake the Philippines, one of the largest naval battles in history unfolded across the waters surrounding Leyte Gulf. The stakes were immense because control of the Philippines would cut Japan off from vital resources in Southeast Asia and disrupt its remaining supply lines. Japanese commanders devised a complex plan to divide and weaken the opposing fleet. Decoy forces were sent to draw attention away from the main objective, while other groups prepared to strike from different directions. The plan relied on timing coordination and the willingness of crews to face overwhelming odds. As the battle began, fleets moved across vast distances, with aircraft launching from carriers and ships preparing for engagement. In one sector, powerful surface forces clashed in close-range combat, where battleships, cruisers, and destroyers exchanged fire in a dramatic and intense confrontation. Shells streaked across the water and explosions illuminated the night as ships maneuvered to gain advantage. In another part of the battle, aircraft played a decisive role, attacking ships from above with bombs and torpedoes. Pilots flew through heavy anti-aircraft fire, aiming to strike critical targets, while defenders worked to protect their vessels. The scale of the engagement created a sense of constant movement and danger as events unfolded simultaneously across different areas. The battle also saw the first organized use of kamikaze attacks, where pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into enemy ships. These missions reflected the desperation of the situation and the intensity of commitment expected from those involved. The impact of these attacks caused significant damage and introduced a new and troubling dimension to naval warfare. Despite moments of success, the overall outcome of the battle favored the Allied forces. Japanese naval strength was severely weakened, and the ability to conduct large-scale operations was greatly reduced. The loss of ships, experienced crews, and coordination marked a turning point from which recovery was no longer possible. For those who witnessed the battle, it was a vast and chaotic struggle where the fate of fleets and nations was decided through courage, strategy, and sacrifice. Iwo Jima and the fight beneath the ground. As the war moved closer to Japan's home islands, the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima became a critical objective due to its strategic location between Japan and Allied bases. Japanese defenders prepared for the invasion by constructing an extensive network of underground tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions designed to withstand bombardment and prolong resistance. When the assault began, Allied forces faced heavy fire as they landed on the beaches. The terrain itself posed a challenge with soft volcanic ash, making movement difficult and reducing the effectiveness of traditional defenses. Every advance required careful coordination and determination as defenders used hidden positions to launch attacks and then disappear beneath the surface. The battle became a slow and intense struggle with progress measured in small gains. Soldiers moved cautiously, clearing positions one by one while facing constant yai from unseen enemies. The underground network allowed defenders to reposition and continue fighting even after initial positions were overrun. artillery air support, and close combat all played roles in the battle, but the determination of both sides made it especially costly. The iconic raising of a flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of perseverance, yet it represented only one moment in a much longer and difficult campaign. Conditions on the island were harsh with heat dust and the constant pressure of combat affecting those involved. Supplies had to be carefully managed and medical care provided under challenging circumstances. After weeks of fighting, the island was secured, but at great cost. The battle demonstrated the intensity of resistance that could be expected as forces approached Japan itself and highlighted the human toll of such Chijane, Okinawa, and the final barrier. The battle for Okinawa was one of the largest and most intense engagements of the Pacific War, bringing together land, sea, and air forces in a prolonged struggle. The island's proximity to the Japanese mainland made it a key objective, and both sides understood its importance. Japanese defenses were deeply prepared, with fortified positions across the island designed to slow and exhaust advancing forces, rather than defending the beaches heavily. The strategy focused on drawing attackers inland where terrain and prepared positions could be used effectively. As the battle unfolded, troops advanced through varied landscapes, including hills, forests, and villages, each presenting unique challenges. Fighting was fierce, with defenders using caves, tunnels, and fortified lines to resist. Artillery bombardments and infantry assaults occurred repeatedly as both sides sought to gain ground. At sea, the intensity of the conflict continued with waves of kamikaze attacks targeting Allied ships. These attacks caused significant damage and created constant tension among naval crews who had to remain alert at all times. Air battles filled the skies as both sides attempted to gain advantage. Civilians on the island were caught in the middle of the conflict, facing displacement, danger, and difficult choices as the fighting spread. The human cost extended beyond the military to include the local population, adding another layer of tragedy to the battle. The campaign lasted for months with heavy losses on both sides before the island was finally secured. Okinawa became a clear indication of what an invasion of the Japanese mainland might involve, influencing decisions about how to bring the war to an end. Hiroshima Nagasaki and the end of war. In the final stage of the conflict, new and devastating weapons were used that would change the course of history. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought unprecedented destruction in moments, transforming cities and causing immense loss of life. The impact of these events was immediate and overwhelming, with buildings destroyed, fires spreading, and communities shattered. Survivors faced unimaginable conditions as they tried to understand what had happened and respond to the aftermath. These bombings, combined with the broader military situation, including continued pressure from Allied forces and the entry of new opponents into the war, created a situation where continuation was no longer possible. The decision to surrender was made, ending the conflict and bringing a close to years of war. The announcement of surrender marked a profound moment for the nation, signaling the end of imperial ambitions and the beginning of a new chapter. For people across Japan, it was a moment of relief, uncertainty, and reflection as they faced the task of rebuilding their lives and their country. The events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain among the most significant and sobering in human history, serving as a reminder of the consequences of war and the importance of seeking peace, firebombing the cities, and the war at home. As the war entered its final phase, the skies above Japan became a constant source of danger as large-scale bombing campaigns targeted major cities and industrial centers. Aircraft flew in waves across long distances, carrying incendiary weapons designed to ignite fires in densely built urban areas where wooden structures stood close together. One of the most devastating of these attacks took place over Tokyo. where firestorms spread rapidly through neighborhoods, consuming homes, streets, and everything in their path. The heat became intense, winds fed the flames, and escape routes were quickly overwhelmed. People fled, carrying what they could, seeking safety along rivers or in open spaces, while emergency efforts struggled to contain the destruction. Other cities experienced similar attacks as the strategy aimed to weaken industrial production and reduce the ability to sustain the war effort. Factories, warehouses, and transportation networks were targeted, but the impact extended far beyond these sites, affecting entire communities. Daily life for civilians became increasingly difficult. Food shortages grew more severe, and rationing limited access to basic supplies. Families adapted by finding alternative sources of food and making use of whatever materials were available. Schools and workplaces adjusted schedules or closed as conditions worsened. Air raid sirens became a familiar sound, signaling the need to seek shelter. People constructed simple defenses and organized local efforts to respond to fires and damage. Despite these preparations, the scale of the attacks often exceeded what could be managed. The experience of war at home created a shared sense of hardship and endurance. It also brought the reality of the conflict directly into the lives of ordinary people, shaping their understanding of the situation and the urgency of its conclusion, the Soviet advance and the collapse of remaining resistance. In the final days of the war, another major development occurred as Soviet forces entered the conflict against Japan, launching a rapid offensive into territories in Northeast Asia. This campaign moved quickly, overwhelming Japanese positions that were already strained by years of war and limited resources. Troops advanced across difficult terrain, using coordinated tactics and significant manpower to break through defenses. The speed of the advance left little time for organized resistance, and many units found themselves cut off or unable to regroup. This new front added to the pressure already faced by Japan, creating a situation where continued resistance became increasingly untenable. The combination of ongoing bombing campaigns, naval blockade, and now a major land offensive from the north intensified the urgency of decision-making at the highest levels. For those on the ground, the experience was one of rapid change and uncertainty. Orders shifted as the situation evolved, and the focus moved from holding territory to managing retreat or surrender where possible. Civilians in affected regions faced sudden transitions in control, adding to the broader disruption caused by the war. The Soviet advance played a significant role in shaping the final outcome by further limiting Japan's options and demonstrating that the conflict had reached a point where continuation would only lead to greater loss. Voices of soldiers and civilians in the final days. As the war approached its end, the experiences of individuals both on the battlefield and at home reflected the strain and complexity of the situation. Soldiers stationed in remote locations faced isolation, dwindling supplies, and the challenge of maintaining morale while conditions deteriorated. Letters, when they could be sent, carry messages of hope, concern, and reflection, connecting them to families far away. On the home front, civilians adapted to daily challenges with resilience. Communities organized to share resources, support one another, and respond to emergencies. Despite the hardships, people continued to find moments of normalcy through small routines, conversations, and acts of kindness. Stories from this time reveal a mix of emotions, including determination, fear, exhaustion, and a desire for peace. Children grew up in an environment shaped by conflict, while elders drew on past experiences to guide their communities. Medical workers and volunteers played critical roles, caring for the injured and supporting those affected by the war. Their efforts often took place under difficult conditions with limited supplies, yet they continued to provide aid where possible. The end of the war brought a sudden shift in perspective as the announcement of surrender reached the population. For many, it was a moment of relief combined with uncertainty about the future. The long period of conflict had left deep marks on society, and the path ahead would require rebuilding both physically and emotionally. These voices and experiences form an essential part of understanding the war, not just as a series of events, but as a human story shaped by countless individuals, navigating extraordinary circumstances, the aftermath, and the first steps toward recovery. With the end of the war, Japan faced the immediate challenge of recovery. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was damaged, and millions of people needed support. The focus shifted from conflict to rebuilding, creating a new sense of purpose centered on restoration and renewal. Efforts began to clear debris, restore essential services, and provide shelter for those who had lost their homes. Food distribution systems were reorganized to address shortages and ensure that basic needs could be met. Communities worked together to rebuild neighborhoods, often starting with simple structures and gradually expanding as resources became available. Occupation authorities introduced reforms aimed at reshaping the political and social structure of the nation. New laws were implemented and institutions were reformed to create a more stable and inclusive system. Education and public services were prioritized as part of the long-term recovery process. Economic activity slowly resumed as industries restarted and new opportunities emerged. Workers returned to factories, fields, and offices, contributing to the rebuilding effort. Trade began to recover, and connections with the global economy were re-established. Culturally, this period involved reflection on the past and consideration of the future. The experiences of the war influenced art, literature, and public discourse, shaping how people understood their history and identity. The aftermath was not an easy transition, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter where the lessons of the past would guide the direction of the future. Through resilience, cooperation, and determination, Japan moved forward, laying the foundation for the remarkable transformation that would follow in the decades ahead. Occupation reforms and the reshaping of society. In the years immediately following the war, Japan entered a period of occupation that brought sweeping changes to its political, social, and economic systems. The goal was to transform the nation into a stable, peaceful, and democratic society while preventing a return to militarism. This process was guided by new leadership structures and a series of reforms that reached into nearly every aspect of daily life. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of a new constitution which redefined the role of government and the rights of citizens. The emperor remained as a symbolic figure while political power shifted to elected representatives. Principles such as freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the renunciation of war were established, creating a framework for a different kind of nation. Land reform played a major role in altering the structure of rural society. Large estates were broken up, and land was redistributed to those who worked it, giving farmers greater independence and security. This change not only improved economic conditions in the countryside, but also reduced the influence of traditional elites. Education was also transformed with a new system that emphasized critical thinking, science, and global awareness. Schools expanded access to learning and encouraged the development of skills needed for a modern society. Students were introduced to new ideas and perspectives, shaping a generation that would contribute to the country's recovery. Industries were reorganized to reduce concentration of power and encourage competition. While the process was complex, it helped create a more balanced economic environment where innovation and efficiency could grow. Workers gained new rights and protections, improving conditions and contributing to stability. Daily life during this time was still marked by hardship as rebuilding continued, but there was also a sense of possibility. people adapted to new systems, participated in emerging institutions, and began to envision a future different from the past. The economic miracle and the rise of a modern power. In the decades that followed, Japan experienced a period of rapid economic growth, often described as a miracle due to its speed and scale. Industries expanded production and focused on quality, innovation, and efficiency, allowing Japanese goods to compete successfully in global markets. Factories adopted advanced techniques and management practices that improved output while maintaining high standards. Products such as electronics, automobiles, and machinery became symbols of reliability and technological advancement. Companies grew into major global players, contributing to national prosperity. Infrastructure development supported this growth with modern highways, railways, and ports connecting regions and facilitating trade. High-speed trains transformed travel, reducing time and increasing connectivity between cities. Communication systems improved, allowing information to move quickly and efficiently. Urban areas expanded as people moved to cities for work, creating vibrant and diverse communities. Housing, education, and public services developed to support growing populations. Daily life changed as new opportunities emerged and standards of living improved. Food culture also evolved, reflecting both tradition and modern influences. While rice, fish, and vegetables remained staples, new dishes and dining experiences became available in urban centers. Markets and restaurants offered a wide range of options, catering to different tastes and lifestyles. This period of growth was not without challenges, including economic fluctuations and social adjustments, but the overall transformation was remarkable. Japan emerged as one of the world's leading economies, demonstrating the power of resilience and adaptation. Cultural identity, tradition, and innovation in balance. As Japan advanced economically, it also maintained a strong connection to its cultural heritage, creating a balance between tradition and innovation. Ancient practices such as tea ceremony, calligraphy, and seasonal festivals continued to be valued and practiced even as modern life evolved. Cities reflected this blend, with historic temples and shrines standing alongside contemporary buildings and technology. This coexistence created a unique landscape where past and present interacted in everyday life. Art, literature, and media explored themes of identity change and memory, drawing on both historical experiences and modern realities. Creative expression became a way to understand the nation's journey and to share it with the world. Education and cultural institutions played a role in preserving traditions while encouraging new ideas. Museums, theaters, and schools provided spaces where history and innovation could be explored together. Daily routines often included a mix of old and new, from traditional meals prepared at home to modern conveniences used in work and leisure. Transportation ranged from high-speed trains to local methods, reflecting both efficiency and continuity. This balance allowed Japan to maintain a distinct identity while engaging fully with the global community. It demonstrated that progress does not require abandoning the past, but can build upon it to create something new. Lessons of the empire and reflections on history. Looking back on the long history of the Japanese Empire from its earliest beginnings to its modern transformation, several lessons emerge that continue to hold meaning. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances stands out as a defining strength. Whether through adopting new technologies or reshaping institutions in response to challenges. At the same time, the experience of expansion and conflict highlights the importance of balance and responsibility. The pursuit of power without consideration of consequences can lead to suffering and loss on a wide scale. This understanding has influenced Japan's post-war commitment to peace and cooperation. The role of culture, belief, and identity also remains significant. From early spiritual traditions to modern creative expression, these elements have shaped how people understand themselves and their place in the world. They provide continuity even as society evolves. The resilience shown in times of hardship, from natural disasters to war and reconstruction, demonstrates the capacity of communities to rebuild and move forward. Cooperation effort and shared purpose have been essential in overcoming challenges. Today, Japan stands as a nation that has transformed itself multiple times across history, carrying forward lessons from each era. Its journey offers insight into how societies can grow, change, and find new paths after periods of difficulty. As the story concludes, the echoes of the past remain present in landscapes, traditions, and collective memory, reminding us that history is a living force that continues to shape the present and the future.